one question that it raises for me, because as a description and analysis of the war on terror, I think it's absolutely correct and important. But you started out by saying this is not a state of exception. You're not going to use that. And when you refer to, when you use Kafka, when you use Feldman the way you do, Kafka's not talking about a state of exception either. He's talking about the law. And Benjamin also.
His critique of violence.
So you made a move. Yeah, you made a move from talking about this particular procedure under the war on terror, this Guantanamo thing, monstrosity, to then talking about the war on terror tout court, you know, and well, maybe, and then the next move maybe is talking about war, modern warfare, because wars have been declared since 1941, and etc. But to what extent are you also talking about law and the state, and not this particular exception, or if it is an exception? Or to what extent are you talking about it not as exceptional at all? But as you were describing what the law is like in Guantanamo, as somebody who started my career eons ago as a lawyer and did some criminal defense work, I immediately started thinking about the criminal defense, the trials I've seen and participated in which are surrounded by, that's not the right word, by secrets, in which, well, one secret is that the police lie.
Right.
For example, now we know there's studies now starting to admit that there's massive lying by the police. Well, all the defense attorneys knew that from way back. And the problem always, how can we try to prove this guy not guilty in the eyes of the jury when if it's their word against the cops, they're going to be convicted, and we know the cops are lying. But to go beyond that, so the people, whether people are disappearing into Guantanamo or into one of his prison, into one of Foucault's prisons, is it the same phenomena that, would you do the same analysis for normal law, normal prisons and so forth, or is it a matter of more or less, I mean, is it a matter of is it a different phenomena, or is this see what I'm saying? I mean,
yeah, well, the answer is yes and no, because I'm an ethnographer, so I always work with situated knowledge, and it's no accident that I'm looking at one case, one person, and in my book that this is part of, there's another chapter. The chapter that follows from this chapter is about extrajudicial killing in Afghanistan, where these striker brigade teams, the assassination teams, are fabricating, counterfeiting terrorists, killing civilians, right, and then presenting them to biometric scans and other forensic falsifications as Taliban. So, again, I'm looking at, rather than these being, you see, the state of exception assumes that there's a stable state, a norm, that has been somehow subtracted from,
right,
or provisionally or temporally suspended. When I'm arguing about that state no longer exists, and I don't have the time here, but the use section of this paper, the published version that is just about to come out, is about what talks about apophatic state. Now, apophatic, this is where denegation comes from. It's from a theological concept. And so I'm kind of evading political theology, but not with a Schmittian model. I don't see this as a state of exception. I see this as post-procedural discourse, right? That's masking and hiding and undermining and nostalgically citing the procedure, right? And evoking it and reenacting it in a way that Pierre Lejeune, he has this beautiful phrase he talks about, law as scenic affirmation. And he defines dogma as a truth that is staged. right? And that it becomes true through its scenic affirmation. So, and in this case, I think that one could look at the racial structuration of the political industrial complex and begin to apply that model there. But at the same time, I would also have to, and I'm not, trying to tell the human rights lawyers, that their work is futile. Actually, what's going on is that two forms of sovereignty are coming into conflict here. And that's the Aegon that's exposing some of these issues. I think my project is different than someone like Mark Denbal, who wrote this no hearing study, because I want to see not what this doesn't do, but what it is doing, and what's being reproduced. And that has always been my approach to violence and to state violence, is what does it make? What does it reproduce? How does it turn metaphysics into literality, into facticity? How are facts being constructed, and how are they being instituted? And I became interested in this notion, and in my book, a crucial notion here is this notion of the war on terror as revealability without revelations. Think of the WMDs, right? They disappeared. They never existed. Think of the connection of Saddam Hussein to the 9/11 attack. It evaporates, right? Think of the fact that this is an anti-teleological war. This is not a just war. There's no means, ends, rationality. And ultimately, I make the argument in this book that collateral damage is not a byproduct of the war on terror, but the core ideology of the war on terror, an essential animating mechanism, because the collateral damage say, in being identified as such, that there's a real enemy out there to find.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
But I'm picking up the implication that I'm picking up from this is that the reasons that you're not going into, at least in this study, that there's a tendency that these are tendencies that have an expansive quality that spread.
They do. I call this the becoming non-state of the state. And this is in another section of the book. And what I'm looking at, you look at outsourcing, and you look at the paramilitarization of the state. Look at the fact that there were more soldiers in Iraq engaged in what's called force protection than actually in executing the war. They were there to protect the soldiers who were executing the war. If you look at the fact that you can have, for me, one of the classic examples of revealability without revelation is the Abu Ghraib photographs. They showed absolutely nothing. So and a lot of this comes out of my work on torture in Northern Ireland and South Africa, in the sense that anybody who spends a lot of time working with people who've been tortured, and listening to their narratives, you begin to realize that the least thing that torture is about is the acquisition of information. It's a ritual of reproduction, is the production of power from out of the body of the tortured. And when I was in South Africa, attending the amnesty hearings, and these police officers and these military figures would come and testify. And one of the things that you begin to recognize when you read and listen to their testimonies, I did, was that structural deniability or indemnification was built into the sheer planning of violence from the get-go. It's not an afterthought. It's not ex post facto. It's not a legal rationale. And what really convinced me of that was not only the content of what they're saying, but how they spoke. They all had this uniform language of depersonalization, right? Where they could distance themselves, remove themselves from the consequences of their own acts. So I think, I'm proposing a new theory of the state. I'm also saying that we deal with a polycentric state. This is an extension of Foucault's model of the deinstitutionalization of the state, where he rejects the kind of model of an Archimedean state that draws on the pre-existing deposits of power and applies them repressively to a body, but rather that we have a series of performativities that produce a centration effect, right? And these are instantiated performances. In many ways, I am going against Machiavelli, who, when he talks about this relationship of the prince in terms of sustaining his virtue as he encounters fortuna, right? The accident, the aleatory, chance, right? There is no, that the state does not sustain an identity in all of its acts. And in the article that's posted, on the Truth Commission, I began to explore this notion of intentionalist continuity in the execution of war. And I'm focusing on so this notion of revealability without revelation, my turn to apophatics, which I'll talk about in a minute, is looking at what I call the demediatization of violence. Now, I just had an encounter with Manuel Castells, who for him everything is network, everything is media. And actually my work is about the breakdown in mediation, and what emerges, the surplus information that emerges from the demediatization of violence. And I'm taking this from apophatics. Now what apophatics is a theological posture that appeared in the early patristic writings, of the Christian theologians. This also precedes them. It's there in the Stoics, and there's also a Jewish tradition of apophatics. And really is about these theologians, basically describing God in order to show that God is undescribable, right? So every enunciation renunciates itself. And basically, as you intensify these impossible descriptions of an undescribable God, you produce what's called an ineffability effect. So I'm beginning to look at these type of sequences, like Guantanamo, or these extrajudicial assassinations that are based on counterfeiting, as these apophatic practices that are producing what I call an intouchable or impassible state, right? But one that has no center, right? Because the issue here is that you can only, and that's what apophatics teaches us, you only can get at the inaccessibility, the heat is called hypoousios in Greek, the above or beyond being of God, by showing how he's uncontainable within any kind of empirical sentence or description. Now, if we translate that to the war on terror, those moments of empirical inscription and description are acted on the bodies of others, right? In other words, we produce these bodies that bear witness to the inaccessibility of American sovereignty. And to me, the drone weapon, the drone plane, which is a kind of detachable, autonomic, the sovereign decision, right? Because it decides who gets to live and who dies. A kind of ethical, mechanized apparatus that kills at a distance, right? And that drone plane, to me, also is comparable to what I call drone democracy by drones.
Well, the reason
this is a wider.
The reason I think this what you're doing is one reason. Another reason I think it's so important is that it really runs counter to, it directly runs counter to the tendency that we have in this country to think in terms of cycles of return, a normalcy return.
Right.
Like we got an economic crisis, it's got to be ending, right?
Right.
I mean, how can it still be going on? Isn't it over? That sort of thing. We have war, but now Obama's pulling out the troops, so now we're going to have peace, right? But we're not.
No.
And this analysis, indicates kind of why not.
That's why I ultimately connected to this issue of debt. And this is I couldn't go into it, but this is basically kind of citing Walter Benjamin's essay on capitalism as religion. Capitalism for Walter Benjamin is a cult, a religious cult, that, unlike other religions, permits of no atonement. It's endless guilt. It's endless indebtedness. And I see that structure in the war on terror, and I see that, there's a beautiful quote by Benjamin where he says, one day, in reference to Kafka, one day wakes up and finds himself converted to vermin, or to an insect, right? That's what happened to the Greek people. One day they wake up and say they're guilty, right? Guilty of what? And no one can get back to the origins of these subprime derivatives, right? No one knows what these stand for. There actually are activist groups who are trying to buy these things up, and they can never get back to the origin. No one knows where it's a deferred effect, And what happens here is that we're seeing deconstructionist principles, but they're no longer principles of analysis or critique or hermeneutic suspicion. They're actually effective material practices of the state. So what I'm always interested here, I'm not making an argument that war on terror is unrepresentable or it's sublime, like people would make in reference to the Holocaust, because constantly I'm looking at how these apophatic or situations of denegation or of disframing have to be accessed through material performances, through material effects on real bodies, on real people, in real spaces, right? But at the same time, I'm looking at how violence simultaneously in this enactment immaterializes itself. And I wrote about this quite early on This is an elaboration of an essay I wrote on the Rodney King trial, where, you know, it was self-evident, right? The police were guilty, yet they were found not guilty. And I called that cultural anesthesia, how the state produced a cultural anesthesia, that Rodney King's pain as a human being was rendered inadmissible to that trial. And actually he was converted, not only was his pain rendered inadmissible, but people walked out of that trial seeing him as the author of the violence that was enacted against him, right? The aggressor. And the police were, and the police they basically planted their violence on King with all sorts of racialized fictions and imaginaries.
Let me get to Kevin's.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, I want to come back. Rich started to ask a question that I was going to ask, but I'm thinking about it and propose some kind of answer. So you were basically saying, isn't given the kind of pureness of power of the tribunal merely the type case of what criminal justice is anyway? And that would have been my question. Doesn't it represent what criminal justice is? But I think, thinking about it, I think not, because evidence is constructed all the time, and lab results are either screwed up or falsified all the time. But the fiction of having empirical evidence remains in usual criminal trials, even if it's fiction. To have it, to have the DNA, to have the fingerprints remain.
Right.
The difference here is that you don't need the fiction, the simulacrum of evidence. And what that seems to me is that this is really a reversion of Foucault's notion of you start out with sovereign and torture, and eventually it becomes the state, becomes more rational, the penitentiary, let's rehabilitate. But as you were describing Guantanamo,
There's no rehabilitation.
it's a dungeon.
Really,
It's a dungeon. It's a pre-modern dungeon. You lock someone away, you chain him to the pillar, right, on Lake Geneva, you chain him to the pillar and you go away, and there's no question about what their crime was, who will ever visit them. It's the Count of Monte Cristo with no way out.
But at the same time, there's a productivity there. It's not just locking him out of the way to be unseen. So these behavioral infractions are very, that's why I got interested in them, why they were used as part of the adjudicating moment. So that, as I argued, and I had to go to Italian immaterial label theory to get at this issue, that in their non-compliance to the prison regime, they were reproducing the war on terror.
Okay,
And that's
a parallel argument, but let me finish my point here. So it's a dungeon, and the reason why you can do away with the fiction of even the falsified fingerprint report is that you're reverting to the pre-modern idea of mystery. The mysteries.
That's why I call it media theology.
And that's why your theological metaphor makes sense, because you're dealing with the symbol and mysteries. You're dealing with the early Christian mysteries. You're dealing with the mysteries of the Kabbalah. And in some way, it's taking I won't use the word evolution, but it's taking the kind of genealogical relationship that Foucault proposed, and it's reverting it back to a pre-modern time. Now, it's no longer the rack, so there is a technical rationality
but they might be throwing us in the.
The rack's still there.
But there's now a water.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a dungeon. I think that the pure form of corrupted but still empirically grounded criminal justice has now moved because the sovereign has become so powerful that now what you have is a return to mysteries.
Yeah.
But there's a socio-legal issue there too, is that whether this stuff is gonna now corrupt
Well,
what
that's what I was
remains of the
wondering.
modern.
Well, that's what I was wondering.
It already has.
Yeah.
It already has, right? You can now know this you can no longer question these warrantless searches, right? It takes the whole notion of the grand jury and generalizes it onto the whole criminal justice system insofar as it's a security.
Well, the notion of the law as a transcendentalized foundation of the state is being, destroyed here. But then the law reappears in situated circumstances, so you can have a denegation of law. You can have a procedural event, that follows common law and all rules of evidence, and that can coexist with something like Guantanamo. It's the coexistence that interests me. That's why I had to reject the notion of the state of exception, right? Because basic law is supposed to be suspended. The law goes on, and I mean, even in South Africa, there were guys who tortured, and they went to prison under the apartheid regime. The people who killed Steve Biko went to prison. That always fascinated me. How did that happen? That there were still judges and courts operating within that system, within that extra-legal, illegal system, and they were following procedural reason.
Nazi Germany or something?
Yeah, the same thing. But the issue of the evidence, I think, is very important. There are two things here about the secret. The secret has, what interests me here about the ephemerality of the secret, and that's why I'm saying I'm not trying to talk about a sublimity of violence that's beyond representation. After Auschwitz, there could be no poetry. I'm not saying that. I'm interested in the material effects of the ineffable. And it has to be read in an apophatic discourse. The ineffable, the invisible, has to be rendered visible in compromised forms of materiality. Materiality that's punctured with absence, with nothingness, with gaps, with inconsistencies. That's where I begin. And I actually find this in particular, ethographically, particular local events. And I'm trying to get at that through these local events. So in the case of the Rodney King issue, we talk about material evidence, and you talk about, can we expand what's happening to the law? In that trial, the whole chain of material evidence was completely suspended in reference to the video, right? The video itself was seen as a material piece of evidence equivalent to a fingerprint or a blood stain, or even they didn't have it at that time, but a DNA test. But not only that, the defense manipulation of the video with freeze frame, stop motion, time coding, and all that was never questioned as an illicit manipulation of the material. It was simply our media realism took over, and our racial imaginaries took over and made that the equivalent to a fingerprint, or to a blood stain, So there, I think you begin the kind of remystification of the material evidence. And a really interesting book on that for me is, which you may know about, is John Tagg's book, The Burden of Representation. He wrote it in the 80s. He's a Foucauldian. He's looking at penal psychiatric charitable photography in mid-19th century England in the 1850s, right? And by 1850, after the invention of cheap daguerreotypes, there are like 53,000 institutional photographs being made, okay, that have been made by prisons, by asylums, by poorhouses. And he's interested in how does the photograph become evidentiary, right? And how does this criteria of material evidence becomes applied to the photograph. And he looks at the dossiers, the photograph inserted with a transcript, the bodily measurements, the fact that the photographs are meant to typify, to construct a specimen that can be read across a series of such images. And you began to see the metaphysical dimension of the evidentiary in Western legal
So I have a question.
thinking.
So, you were invited here, and at one level, you really killed us by the Center for Study of Narrative and Conflict Resolution. And, I wonder about the consequences of the fate of narrative
Yeah.
in this. Could you wax on that for a minute?
Well, I think one of the big issues for me is what happens to witnessing in this type of situation. If I can find this section where I write about that. I've argued already in my work in South Africa that basically one of the characteristics of late modern war, that it's a war against witnessing.
Yes.
And I call this the loss of loss, because we don't even know what we have lost, right? And this war against witnessing is pursued through what I call the structuring of violence in such a way that is identified as it's being enacted. It's being withdrawn
exactly.
as it's being instantiated
Yes.
in the bodies and the spaces of others. And so the challenge is not that this cannot be written, but how do you write it? The realist models. I wrote an essay back in the late 90s about realism and how realism has has traditionally been the customary authenticating discourse for describing violence, and how we may have to draw on other traditions of description, like, say, Dada, or Surrealism, aesthetic discourses that came out of World War I, and the experience of mechanized warfare in World War I, and they began to look at the body. So that's my own work. My turn to apophatics is an attempt to describe this, at the same time acknowledging the limits of description and how do you witness this war against witnessing. So that's what I'm doing. How do you witness?
Because if we don't
How
have
do you
that-
witness the loss of loss?
Exactly. If we don't have that, if we don't have the possibility anymore
Yeah.
of time, of narrative,
Right.
I don't know what.
Well, you know,
Totally lost.
Yeah, one of the arguments being made that kind of intersects with what you were asking. Are you familiar with this book by E.O. Weissman, The Lesser of Two Evils?
No,
You know Weissman's work?
I know that.
Yeah, he's basically arguing that, you know, if you start with the Nuremberg hearings and the Eichmann trial, there was a hegemony of the spoken, living ear witness and eye witness of events like the
Right.
Holocaust. But he traces this process, but he has a chapter where he discusses how that spoken or ear witness is being sublimated and displaced by forensic archaeology and forensic medicine, right? So the witness doesn't even have to be alive anymore, that the forensic remains, the archaeological dispositions of remains becomes the bearer of witness for history. And that has, you know, severe issues to that. You know, I cannot accept that as a simply, you know, idea of progress. We've made progress.
Yeah.
We now have a scientific determination of genocide or ethnocide or something like that. At the same time, I have to think that transitional justice has promoted, an essay I've written compares transitional justice, the theater of transitional justice in South Africa with Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
And the thing that interests me here is that confessional witnessing, recuperation of linear time, the fact that witnessing can be structured within a system of equivalencies, not only through reparations, but also through other forms of equation, runs up against the witnessing of violence in Hellenic tragedy. In Hellenic tragedy, what happens, there's two things that happens with the witnessing of violence. One, violence always occurs off stage, so they recognize the inaccessibility of violence. You very rarely see it on stage. Two, you have multiple people witnessing the act, and of course, their narratives are discontinuous or contradictory. And then, you know, in a play like Oedipus, where Oedipus employs a legal and then later on a medicinal or a medical language to find out what's causing the plague in Thebes, what Greek tragedy shows is the incommensurability of different discursive institutions, whether it's the law of kinship, whether it's legal law of the modern city-state, whether it's medicine, or whether it's religion, that they all clash in their ability, in their inability to agree on a description of the crime that has taken place. And that's one of the issues that the Truth Commission tends not to deal with. It deals with a kind of positivist form of witnessing, and doesn't and grafts it onto a variety, the whole discourse of trauma, for example,
Right.
popularization.
Right.
So I try to kind of complexify that one thing we have to deal when we deal with witnessing and narrative and memory, that whenever we do this, we have to look at the memory of memory.
Right.
How is memory functioning in situ in a particular political situation, and not assume that memory is automatically therapeutic or redemptive or recuperative. So, yeah, I think that the war on terror is a challenge. It
The narrative
decenters
itself,
ethnographic
I mean,
realism,
Yeah.
media realism, it decenters all those capacities. That's why you write about Zero Dark 30 as being, these are very conservative. Argo and Zero Dark 30 are very, very conservative films because they convince us that we can recuperate the sovereignty of the state in the war.
Did you see The Gatekeepers?
I've seen excerpts from
Did you
this.
see
Yeah.
it? Holy mackerel.
Yeah.
So there's the 5 guys from, what is it, it's Shenbet,
Yeah, the
from
Mossad,
the
yeah.
intelligence,
Yeah.
from the Israeli Intelligence Society, who were the leaders of the organization for a number of years. And they serially, it's not serially, they tell the story of their time in the organization and what they did. And you see into the history of Israel through their storytelling about what happened and what were the episodes and what they did and how they felt about it and all that. Oh my God. And they end up, each one of them, in front of the camera, so unbelievable with their faces right there, describing how the very thing they did to try to increase the security of Israel screwed up. So they were completely reflexive. One of them said, you know, here's what happens. You do this kind of thing for a long time, then you retire, and then you become a leftist. It was completely an alternative genre. So I give you the gatekeepers. You should go see it, and then I'd be really interested in your description of witnessing, you know, and what's possible right now. Because it's a question that I had about what's the role of narrative in the war on terror? You know, what is the place of narrative in the war on terror?
I could quote you just to give you some of the real implications of an apophatic state or an apophatic sovereignty. This is from Ryan Sherman, who was my teacher in philosophy at the New School. And he says, he's describing apophatics, he says, these negations have but one goal, to keep us from conceiving the one as position, as thesis. Keep us from conceiving the one, not to be the state, the sovereign, as thesis or as position. Right? Which I translate as that makes the witnessing of the state quite complicated, you know.
Very
Keep us from witnessing, you know, because it doesn't have a stable position. It moves around. It has internalized the aleatory or the random or chance-like structure of terror as a state technology of power.
That's very discouraging.
Well, my work is never cheerful.
Yeah, well, it's
Someone once asked me, you know, how come you wrote such a sad book about Northern Ireland?
I didn't find it that way. Well, I think we've just about reached our time, and I want to thank you enormously. The language, I would say, is so dense and beautiful. It's like poetry. And so finally, I just had to stop trying to understand every word and just flow into it. It's very beautiful.
Well, you know, I think the other issue, you talk about narrative, one of the things, and actually, you know, I had some students who did, why is describing him as democratizing, you know, the tribunal or the secret text? Because he wants to read it.
That's good. That's
In other words, that command, that will to witnessing is a will to literature, to interpretation. And one of the things
and
that
the
really,
privilege of interpreting.
yeah, and you know, Derrida says wherever you have literature, you have democracy. You know, because you have multiple interpretations.
Well, maybe that's a good final, at least a more hopeful point for us to consider as we depart. So thank you very much.
Thank you.